Hey everybody, Cyber Talent with you. We finished up Game 10 of the World Chess Championships between Magnus Carlsen and Carlsen-Nepomniachtchi. Much more solid game than the performances we've seen in the past few games, luckily. Carlsen had the white pieces. E4. I think this, even on the first move, is sort of a sign that Carlsen is okay with a draw. He's seen what Nepomniachtchi's brought against E4. And he's seen that it's extraordinarily solid, that Nepomniachtchi has not really prepared any big risk-taking openings against e4. Plus, in general, it seems like 1e4 is harder to get chances against at the very top. Which certainly turned out to be the way in this game. Nepomniachtchi repeated with e5. It seemed pretty clear that he really wanted a day to sort of gather himself back up after the tragedy in Game 9, which you really can't blame him. Of course, if he's looking for a fight, I think the Sicilian is still the most aggressive opening you can play as black. And it seems to have lost favor at the very top. It might simply just be the style of who the world champion is at the time. Of course, Carlsen played the Sveshnikov against Caruana in the last World Championship match. But in general, it seems like games at the top tend more towards 1, e4, e5 than other openings. But I've played the Sicilian all my life. If you're looking for a fight as black, which I think, especially for improving players, you should always be looking for a fight. You should always be looking to play aggressively and assertively. The Sicilian's hard to beat. But Nepomniachtchi played e5, and we stuck with the Petrov. I think this really showed immediately that he was really looking for a day to collect himself and sort of solidify. I have to mention the extraordinarily stupid questions that were asked him at the press conference after the game. More or less asking him if he was still planning on winning the match, and all he said was, quite properly, that's an absurd question. Which chess journalism is pretty awful, apparently. Knight e5, d6. Knight d3. This is a little bit offbeat. Carlsen had played this previously against Caruana in their match. Of course, this would be d4 would be the most played, and then fashion at the top for a while was knight c3. When white's looking to use his slight edge in mobilization, these bishops are much more easy to develop than black's bishops. White's planning on using that to try to get some sort of edge from the position. Doesn't always work out, but it is a little bit more interesting than the typical Petroslog that you get from this particular position. But knight d3, it's a little bit interesting, and I think this game certainly could have been interesting if they were looking for a fight today. Knight f4, and this is the point of maneuvering it to d3 instead of f3. The knight comes to f4 where it helps control this d5 square, which means that black's not able to immediately get in the d5 pawn move. Knight f6, d4. Now, the downside is it does allow an early queen trade, so white's more or less committed to playing a queenless middle game, which might or might not be good for chances. Knight c6. This could actually be quite risky. I think Carlsen, given the match situation, he's up 3 points with only 5 games to go. He's not looking to generate any humongous imbalances. But this really could have led to a fight if white was looking for a fight. Most accurate for black's purpose of gaining a draw would be immediately trade, and then knight c6. And then the knight maneuvers back to e7, then we can play c6 to blunt out this bishop on f3, and then this knight can hop to g6 to liquidate that strong knight on f4. This would be quite an equal position. But knight c6, I believe the press conference afterwards, it was sort of implied that Nepomniachtchi had the queen trade prepared, but he sort of mixed up his move order. Perhaps showing again how he's still a little bit out of sorts, and how a day to solidify really was a good idea for him. c3. I mean, it's not a terrible move, but if white were looking for a fight, bishop e3 looks actually pretty promising for white. this queen, now that the queen trade is cut out, this queen on e7 just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And this knight on c6 especially doesn't make any sense, especially since it's vulnerable to being kicked by a d5 push at some point. Bishop f5, I saw this was recommended after the game. I mean, I just think this is... that g-pawn looks like a very, very sore thumb. And that knight on d3 is not misplaced at all. That's a pretty well-placed knight. The line I mostly looked at my analysis of Bishop f5. Just straightforward development, looks strong. Knight c3, Queen b5. This was a very critical line. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, because it's quite far afield from the game, but it is interesting for theory. d5 seems to be the best move. Knight b4, knight a3, bishop c2, knight taking seems less accurate. White's just up a pawn with a positional advantage. Bishop a4 is most accurate here. If the king prevents the fork in c7, this looks very strong for white. Even material, and we have a nice initiative against the black king. Bishop a4. White can't keep the material. If knight d3, rook b7, and suddenly all of white's pieces are hanging. With these exposed kings in a late middle game position like this, again, the fact that the queens are off doesn't guarantee that it's going to be a quiet position. Both the kings are exposed and there's still plenty of material on the board, so all it takes is one little tactical detail, and one of these kings is vulnerable. But this is a little bit of something for white, I think. White's a little bit better mobilized. These kingside pieces are still asleep. That's the main line I looked at. Knight c3 seems to be a little bit more solid, in my opinion. 5, castle, a6. And something like this is a real fight. I think white does have something to play with here. The black's queen side is a little bit weaker than white's queen side. Plus, this pawn on d5 does a pretty good job of cramping black's position. So, this little mix-up from black in the move order could have had big consequences if Carlsen were looking for a fight. And keeping the queens on the board would definitely lead to a fight. But c3, knight d2, bishop e3 is bad now. This c3 move basically cuts out queenside castling for white entirely. That is just such a monstrous bishop to have on that diagonal. The white king can't go over there. So knight d2. Knight d8, bring the knight back to a better square. It can go to e6 to challenge a strong knight, and f4. Plus now black can play c6 to shore up this d-pawn here. Queen x2, entirely proper. It's just time to get the queens off. Castle, castle. Bishop d3, a little bit of an important move. We want to grab this diagonal before black's able to play bishop f5 himself. Rook e8. Knight e6 could have been played. This is also quite drawish. And, I mean, maybe you can say that white has a little bit of a micro edge, but it's just going to fizzle out just like the game with accurate play. Rook e8. Rook e1, we liquidate a little bit more. g3. f3, it's a similar move order. And this is more or less the game. The reason why this position is so drawish, and how easy it is for top players to get a draw from a position like this, the pawn structure is completely symmetrical. So it's 4 versus 4 on the queen side, 3 versus 3 on the king side. So there's no potential for any pawn imbalances. If, say, you moved this d-pawn over to g6, suddenly there's a pawn imbalance. White has a queen side majority, black has a king side majority. There's something for each side to play for in the pawn structure. A lot of times, the pawn structure will more or less entirely determine the course of a game. And here, the fact that the pawn structure is completely symmetrical cuts out most winning attempts. Plus, there's no imbalance in the minor pieces. It's not like white or black has the bishop pair and can try to squeeze something out of that advantage. completely symmetrical minor pieces, completely symmetrical pawn structure. This is, unless one side blunders really hard or just starts to drift really hard, this is fated to be a draw from more or less move 10. F3, similar idea of what we just saw in this note. These pawns are doing a good job of controlling the squares that these minor pieces might use. C6, G4. So this is a little bit critical suddenly for Black. It's important that he finds one accurate move after this. I know after the game they were talking, and Nepo was saying that he was a little bit afraid of A4. But, I mean, this is just a pawn move, and Black can just continue to unravel with his pawns over on the king side. This is just... but here, in this particular position, it is very important that Nepomniachtchi plays G5 immediately. And that is an excellent move, and that immediately equalizes. If Black tries... it drifts and forgets to play this move, it can get a little bit critical suddenly. Suddenly, G5 is met with taking... And then 9h5, White owns the h-file. This g-pawn's a little bit... I can put that on the board. Yeah, so this g-pawn can be a little bit tender. This rook owns the h-file, coordinates well with this bishop on d3. Suddenly this is quite critical for Black. This has definitely gone wrong. But g5 shoos this knight away from its outpost. It locks these pawns down on light squares. It grabs a share of the dark squares for Black. And then f5. And suddenly Black actually has the one sort of pressing here. He's advancing his pawns, threatening f4, taking up space on the king's side. This is looking completely equal. f7. If Black plays f4 here, that gets met with h4. And similar as the previous note, suddenly this g-pawn is going to be pretty vulnerable. The rook can hop to h6 to threaten rook g6 to hit this pawn from behind. This has gone wrong for Black. So Black just brings his king over, makes way for the rook to come to h8 to challenge for the h-file with h5. h6. h5 is also good. I mean, in this position, it's hard for either side to really drift away from triple zeros. h6 is perfectly solid, but h5 also gets the draw. f4, I guarantee that Carlsen specifically played this move with liquidation in mind. He was pretty certain there were 0 winning chances here. Knight g3 also works to get to the draw, but f4 more efficiently sweeps the pieces from the board. The rest of the game really doesn't need any comments. Knight g7, we don't want to allow the rook to start eating pawns on the queen side, so that blocks the rank. White's temporarily a pawn up, but immediately gets taken off. The knight looks very nice in this rank, but rook f6 is just in time. I mean, if Black wanted to be passive, he could also play rook e7, but rook f6 just equalizes immediately. And they agreed to a draw here. They just very efficiently immediately reached the time control and then shook hands. I mean, this was the sort of rest day that Nepomniachtchi needed. He had the black pieces. At the top level, it's really hard to get serious winning chances with the black pieces if White's not interested in a fight. I mean, if Nepo plays the Sicilian, maybe Carlsen gets tempted into sort of a duel. But I also think it's just as likely that Carlsen would have played something like this version of the Rossolimo and just kept 0 winning chances for Black on the board. And I think the people asking Nepo why he's not playing more aggressive chess are just being quite silly. Like, he's playing against one of the greatest, if not the greatest players of all time, and probably the best defensive player of all time. Very few players have managed to breach his defenses with any sort of chess, much less in a World Championship game. So it's a difficult task, but today is the rest day, and then tomorrow on the 10th, Carlsen will have the black pieces, Nepomniachtchi will have the white pieces. I would say this will be Nepomniachtchi's last serious attempt to win a chess game. If we get a draw here, you can be certain that Carlsen with the white pieces after that will find a way to secure a quick draw. So if we're looking for a do-or-die battle to the death, stay tuned for December the 10th, because we're likely to see Nepomniachtchi try just that. We'll see you then.